Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I'm one of your hosts, Derick. With me today is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, let's do it. Genesis 3. We finally started a new chapter. So
Awesome.
Genesis 3, verse 1.
Woohoo!
Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field, and the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" The serpent, the introduction of this character. Now,
Hmm.
this, I think, the most obvious question to ask here, especially if you know where this story is going. Why is there a serpent in the garden?
My favorite. I
So,
love that question. I
yeah,
love that question.
yes, there is much speculation around that question. Much.
Hmm.
I don't actually think I don't think it makes sense for us to get into too much of it here, just because of what I'll say my take is on it in just a second. But what is often actually implied here is that it's the failure of man to protect the garden. This is interesting. This is sort of flipping things on their head, whereas throughout a lot of history, there was a lot of blame placed on women because of the woman eating the fruit, and
Hmm.
the argument here being, well, no, maybe it was the man's fault because he should have protected the garden from the serpent.
Kept the serpent out of there. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
I think the question, I've not heard that one before. I think the question that, and maybe this is borderline sacrilegious of me, is wondering, I imagine God put the serpent there. And I thought, and you think to yourself, why did God put a serpent there? You know, that's that,
Yeah.
and that might be
Yeah.
the ultimate blame
That's
shift. Maybe I'm just falling
sure.
into that strategy of
Yeah.
saying,
Exactly. It's
blaming
God's fault.
everything. Yeah, well, exactly,
Right.
exactly, because that's the most dangerous question to ask.
So
Uh,
I and I guess the way I see this is similar to those lines. I guess I'm not actually entirely sure what to make of it, but we've been taking this approach of let's try not to infer too much, right, into these stories.
mhm.
And considering we aren't given much other detail, perhaps what we're meant to just take away from it is snakes exist. Like serpents exist. They're out there. Uh, Now, the implication of that is, well, what does that say for when the borders of Eden will spread to the entire ends of the earth, right? Are there still serpents then? I mean, in Revelation we see the great serpent is defeated,
Mhm.
Satan, but does that mean all serpents are defeated? I don't know.
Mhm.
um
Mhm.
on that note, though, one thing that's worth realizing is, while we often depict the serpent and woman conversing by the tree in art, in artistic versions of this, we're not actually told in the narrative that that discussion takes place in the garden.
Mhm.
We don't know whether the serpent is even in the garden. Maybe not. Maybe Eve, or the woman, I guess not yet Eve, is outside the garden, and that's discussion is happening there.
Mhm.
We don't
That's a
know.
possibility. Yeah.
There's no location detail really given here.
Yeah.
There's a lot that's assumed. It's assumed the discussion is happening by the tree because the narrative occurs so quickly after, but maybe the narrative is occurring quickly after just because we're just jumping to the next detail and there's no reason to give us scene change or what scenery we're in, because that doesn't matter. um
Yeah.
so I
And
don't.
I mean, we're going along with a lot of things here. I mean, we're just going along with a talking snake too. I mean,
Right, of course.
that's
Yeah.
that's for for
Well,
those who are strict historicists, it's kind of like, well, wait,
wait, yeah, what's the deal with the talking snake?
what's going
uh
on here? Like, wait,
yes.
there's not really exactly a real clinging to historical perspectives there.
Right.
I,
Right.
I I tend to like the pragmatic response to it and just, yeah, I mean, you're saying snakes exist. The way I've liked to frame it is that there is a snake in the garden. Like, look
Yes.
at your life right now.
Yes.
There's a snake in the garden.
Right. And so
Whatever
that's
is going on, whatever we're establishing, whatever perfection
so
we're attaining, there is going to be a snake there.
so if we look at
Watch
this
out.
as being not so much the story of original sin, but really the story of universal sin, explaining why we all sin, well,
Mm-hmm.
we've all dealt with snakes, like
Mm-hmm.
they're around, they exist.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
what
sometimes there's serpents in your head. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, exactly.
saying the exact things that this serpent says. Yeah.
So I think what we could simply take from this is that when it comes to sin, watch out for serpents. That's the lesson we take from this. So I think after that, the next question we would ask is, why a serpent? And so there's a lot of reasons for that. I think particularly one being that in the Orient, so in kind of the ancient times here, the ancient Middle East, all this, snakes were an important symbol. They're a symbol of life and death, wisdom and chaos, and friend and foe. They could sort of fit a bunch of different roles. Snakes were kind of all over the place, but snakes were a big deal, right? They were maybe the largest threat that humans faced, I guess. And there is a sense in which they were powerful, I guess, in that way, which is probably how some people came to have sort of positive ideas of the snake or worship snakes, and that was something that occurred. But then also they're dangerous. So I think a strong case can be made that this story is telling us that rather than something to fear and revere, no, serpents are to be avoided. That's kind of the point of this story. There's not this in between on them. So,
well, and I mean, if you want to look at even modern, we somehow, for some reason, still intuitively understand this, and I don't think it's just Christian influence, but Harry Potter, the entire series, which is it's a grand mythical story. It tells us that snake is the representative of Slytherin. It's representative of Voldemort, the two main things that are evil in that narrative.
Right.
And so it's still, and that still has potency with so many
Yep.
people, and that rings true for so many people. So there's
Yes.
a depth to that goes that supersedes just the context of the Middle
there's
East.
something instinctual about humans that just snake equals bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Scary,
Exactly.
Something, yeah.
It's the enemy. Yeah.
So then the next question we talked, where'd the serpent come from? Why a serpent? And then the question is, who exactly is this serpent? Now, there's a lot of assumption that this serpent is Satan. That's never exactly spelled out anywhere in the Bible. Satan is named the Great Serpent or Dragon in the book of Revelations. And so a lot of people are tying it backwards into, well, that must be this serpent, this particular serpent. And we are told that he's the deceiver of the whole world. So I guess if you really make the original sin argument, then you're really seeing it here. But all those things in Revelations can be true without this serpent being Satan. It doesn't have to be Satan for all those same things to be true. So in absence of any direct proclamation that this is Satan, I don't know why we would necessarily assume that, especially because, I mean, the ancient Hebrews who were reading the story had no conception of Satan in that way, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, that to me seems odd that we would add that to it. Thank you, John Milton and Paradise Lost for probably why so many people make that connection. So
follow that line.
Yeah, I think to me it makes most sense. Again, if we're seeing this as the story of universal sin, I think it's more a role. Like we talked about patterns before, and that this story, especially, I think the pattern thing comes into play a lot. The serpent, like there's a pattern of serpentitude, serpentness, I guess.
There's a serpentine pattern.
Yes, there is, and definitely run that way if you're being fired on by a gun. But that is not quite what I had in mind. But yeah, there's a pattern of being a serpent.
Yes.
And I think that's what this story is trying to show us, is the pattern of serpents. And that can be filled by many people, sometimes even ourselves, as we'll see when we really get into the pattern of the serpent. But and I would say maybe it's the pattern that was best, that feels like a weird word, most accurately filled
or
by
worst.
Satan. Yeah, worst. But most accurately acted out by Satan, if you want to put it that way, right? But I think it's a role that can be filled by many, and I think we'll actually see some of that most clearly when we look to the consequences for sin that God describes at the very end of this chapter. So that's when I think that idea will be made sort of most clear. But generally, I just want to say I personally don't see this as like this was Satan talking to Adam and Eve. I think it's better to understand it as there's a pattern of serpentness. Apologies for anyone that heard the dog. A lot of chaos going on around here. So
that's
all right. So with that in mind, now I think we've discussed the idea of the serpent enough, and we'll get into it much more as we go forward. But that sort of serves as an introduction to serpentness or the serpent pattern. I think we want to look at what the serpent says here, right? I think there's some interesting things. There's a few highlights that I think speaking of the pattern, this is the pattern of the way serpents work. And it's interesting that what the serpent says here, it's actually not meant to be a question in the original Hebrew. That's what several of the commentaries I read said, is this isn't really a question, but it's kind of an eliciting statement that's meant to raise doubt. So it's a statement, but it's clearly a statement trying to get you to respond to that statement and hopefully doubt what you were saying.
Well, it's far more effective to openly question someone. Anyone who is openly questioned, they tend to want to defend.
I was just going to say that's the shrewdness, right? This is the craftiness, the shrewdness of the serpent at play. Is that we see that right there? That is a shrewd way of doing things. Is not asking for an answer for a question, but kind of making a statement that warrants a response. And that sort of pulls someone, when you ask a question, someone feels, I think, like a little more like they're speaking from their own, mind and source and all of that. But if someone makes a statement, now you have to like parse out where the statement is correct and incorrect, and it sort of pulls you into their thought pattern or something, right? It's shrewd, basically. What a fitting description of the so one of the things we can take from that, by the way, is that when it comes to temptation to sin, because that's, I think, what we're building in here with the serpent, is seeing the temptation to sin, is that I think often it doesn't confront us directly, right? Like a question would. A question is sort of a direct confrontation. But it sort of inhibits us. Temptation just kind of places itself in our way. That's not so much of a direct confrontation, but indirect in a way. Much like this statement by the serpent is sort of an indirect way of asking a response. And I think, you're more vulnerable to an attack from the side than attack head on. Right. And this is what we see here in the serpent, in this way of asking a question, but not asking a question, is this attack from the side. Right.
Yeah. It's kind of like using the word technically rather than trying to stick to the spirit of something. So saying, well, technically this isn't wrong. Technically you're not doing something, and it's this sidestepping that's going on, of really making you say, well, let's look at it really, really, really closely and see if there's a way that this could work. That's what happens when that doubt is raised. Rather than confronting someone directly and saying, you think this is wrong? It's that's a little bit, or saying like, well, that can't be wrong. That's a little bit more. That causes someone to start thinking along the lines of, well, why couldn't that be wrong?
Yes. All right. So then another thing here is the serpent has mischaracterized God's decree. One would assume purposely, but and this, I think, is interesting because it's a mischaracterization. He said any tree. Obviously, God didn't say don't eat from any tree in the garden. He had one specific tree. But this is interesting because in many ways, this isn't quite a lie, right? He didn't quite because he poses it sort of as a statement question thing, and it's not, it's kind of, well, God didn't say you couldn't eat from any tree in the garden, right? And it's like, well, yeah, no, he didn't say we couldn't eat from any tree. He said the specific one. So it's not quite a lie. Which again, going to that frontal attack, it's easier to confront a lie, right? But this is it's still a kind of deceit, but it's built upon, you know, some level of truth.
And in a way, it opens up the opportunity for the person to say no. So they feel like they rejected it,
right?
But it still raises doubt.
Yes.
So Eve's able to say no. We just can't eat from this tree.
Yes.
So she got the chance to say to this tempter, no.
Yeah.
She gets to say, which we're not there yet, but gets to say the word no. And that's because of the way the question is phrased.
Yeah.
It's not phrased as God didn't say you can't eat from that and that tree. It's you can't eat from any tree. He's like, no, you got the information correct. And now we're focused on something else.
Right.
That's a little more. That pulls the mind away and doesn't have it thinking about this open confrontation. It's so sideways.
Right. Yeah, sin, I think, too, again, going to the temptation thing, right, that we were talking about. This is sort of the pattern of temptation. This is a way in which sin can be tempting and difficult to avoid, right? For instance, the idea of taking something that would have never been missed. Is that wrong? Well, yeah, it's wrong, but it is also simultaneously true that someone might have never noticed that it was gone, right? Exactly. It's like, well, they'll never know that I took it. So is it okay to take it? No, it's still not okay to take it, even though that other thing can be true. So that's one of the patterns again. And then the last
it's very rare that your first sin is something that's outright rebellion.
Oh, right. Sure.
It's very rare that it shows up in this,
like the outright rebellion.
They might like the outright rebellion, but there's this testing of the waters that goes on, or that there's people who make a habit of just saying, I'm going to burn the world down. Like that's evil. And people can go that direction, but most people tend to go this direction of like, well, is this really that wrong? Is this actually something wrong? Can I convince myself that maybe it isn't wrong? And they kind of like to balance that type of thing. And that's the way it shows up, is it's that serpent showing up being very shrewd.
Yes, indeed. All right. And the last thing the serpent does here that I want to highlight is that, and this is something we don't see in English translation, but what the serpent uses here is a more generic term for God, rather than the more intimate, personal Yahweh. And that's interesting, right? Because that puts some distance, some psychological distance between the woman here and God. And it makes it feel like it's less of a violation in terms of, you know, more personally doing what Yahweh said was wrong. Instead, it's, well, this is what God said, right? It's less intimate, less personal. It creates this kind of distance, which makes it easier to feel like you can get away with violating that command, right? And that's, you know, I think one of the greatest temptations, obviously, around sin is that possibility that we might get away with it, you know, and this creates, I think, a sense of that feeling, this difference in the serpent using God rather than Yahweh.
This is done frequently in wartime. By almost all cultures, by referring to their enemy as some type of derogatory term.
Yep.
Now, this tends to happen in all languages, anyone who's outside the tribe, but it's seen, used, and certainly weaponized. It was weaponized in the past, in the 20th century, a lot in wars, in World War I and World War II, was referring to them. In English, we might say that they refer, which is this barbaric sort of tribe that they're descended from. The Germanic people are descended from the Huns in some way, but you know, they're not exactly the same as they were when they were, you know, invading Europe. It's a different type of connotation. And so it's this distance that's established in order to allow people to permit themselves to do something sinful, you know, or something that they wouldn't normally do.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. All right. And so all this basically, I think it lives up to the serpent's reputation here, we're told of, as being the shrewdest, craftiest amongst all the creatures. And it sets the stage for the woman's response. We'll see some things echoed in the woman's response. So we'll see that next time. So until then, be sure to like, subscribe, follow, review, share with friends. Email us unschooltheology@protonmail.com. Check out our website, get on our mailing list, all that jazz, and we will see you next time. Thanks.